Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, on this, the eve of Halloween, some campaigns now rest in peace, while others remain spirited. We'll analyze the results from last Saturday's election, including a gubernatorial runoff that may be a thriller. Joining us at the cauldron are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com, and Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Excuse me. We're going to go first over to Jeremy, and it's now down to 2. We're in a gubernatorial runoff. What can we expect?
Well, at the end, there can only be one, right?
Yeah.
But look, you can tell we're on a shortened time frame. I mean, this race shot out of a cannon on Monday with new ads, endorsements, money. But the week capped off this morning with a endorsement for John Bel Edwards from the Sheriff's Association. He was surrounded by a group of sheriffs in Baton Rouge, some of them Republican. And I think that it shows that this is going to be a very localized grassroots campaign. Around the edges, you're starting to see some of the clerks and the assessors and the courthouse crowd really start to pay attention to this race, and in particular John Bel Edwards. They're worried about their local budgets. They're worried about the inventory tax. Parish presidents, too, are going through these questionnaires and seeing that David Vitter would repeal it and replace it. That makes them nervous, while John Bel Edwards is saying that he'll leave it alone. A few hours later in Baton Rouge again at the Pelican House Bar, David Vitter had a Republican rally. He was surrounded by most of the congressional delegation or their wives. Roger Villery with the Louisiana Republican Party. He's starting to get a lot of national help coming in, and this is very much a nationalized campaign. We're hearing David Vitter talk about immigration, President Obama, things that more or less have absolutely nothing to do with the way the next governor is going to govern. So you have a nationalized campaign on one side, you have a very localized campaign coming together on the other side, and I think those are some of the battle lines that are being drawn for this runoff.
And then on the Democratic side, you have some money coming in from national sources, about $300,000 so far. I think they're kind of surprised to find that they have a real candidate and a real shot here and are regrouping. And the first ad that the Democratic Governors Association sponsored is actually a very effective ad featuring the 2 Republicans who lost. Clips from them at the 2 debates, at debates where they're really criticizing David Vitter very strongly. Neither one has endorsed. May well not endorse, but their words are on tape and being used against Vitter.
And the DGA has teamed up with Gumbo PAC, an anti-Vitter super PAC, on the soft money side of this race for independent expenditures, and that was their first joint effort. But Gumbo PAC also released a poll this week, a very Democratic poll, but it shows even odds on splitting on grabbing the majority of the vote from Scott Angel or Jay Darden.
And it had, what was it, 52-40 for... I think it was 52-40 for
the horse
Edwards,
race question.
For the horse race question.
If David Vitter is 23%, shockingly lower than people expected. I mean, everybody expected him to get into the runoff.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I convinced myself that his absolute floor was probably going to be 20% in that primary. But I think not only his number, but also the gap between him and John Bel Edwards surprised a lot of people. And look, you know, John Bel Edwards managed to capture 23 rural parishes that Mary Landrieu did not, and he captured several more. If you look at his vote versus the combined vote of Jay Darden and Scott Angel, he received more votes in 31 parishes than those 2 candidates did put together, plus another 2 parishes where he tied that combined tally. But if you look at all the parishes, all of those parishes, the lion's share, gave 55 to 60% or more of their vote to the Republican candidates. I see a tough road ahead for both John Bel Edwards and for David Vitter, and this all comes down to influence. Who is going to influence the voters? Is it going to be David Vitter with his nationalized message linking John Bel Edwards to liberals and Barack Obama, or is it going to be John Bel Edwards with his message of integrity and the honor code and I will not lie, steal, cheat, or tolerate anyone who does? I've seen it enough.
Well, we've already seen a Senate race last year with the Cassidy race, and it was Obama, and he was elected on that. What is it about Obama? I mean, is there something about that the voters in Louisiana just really, really don't like that? That turns these elections around?
Are you asking Jeremy? Jerry,
Well,
you wanna take
you
that?
know, I think that there are a lot of things that I think there's that narrative we kept hearing about that he's going to take our guns. That there's the Obamacare narrative, and I think on both sides, for both liberals and conservatives, we've gotten to a point where people don't want to learn the truth. They want to be convinced of what they believe the truth is what the truth is,
and criminals and crime, because that's the subject of a Vitter
Right, and
ad, basically
that's a
trying to link the
controversial
two,
video, right, yeah.
which is ironically an issue that's really very bipartisan. Prison sentencing reform.
Right.
A lot of Republicans support that too. Really, even David Vitter.
Well, the ad said, the ad sponsored by David Vitter said that John Bel Edwards had a plan to release thugs on our
Dangerous
streets in Louisiana,
thugs.
and let's not forget that David Vitter, in the WDSU debate, was the one who piped up first and said that we're warehousing way too many nonviolent criminals, and now he's attacking
Right.
John Bel Edwards. But today at the sheriff's endorsement, the sheriffs really did step up and kind of said that they're with him because they feel like John Bel Edwards would explore some of these pilot programs like you see in Texas and everything else. But
Under Rick Perry, another good Republican.
Right. And there was news out of this press conference this morning. One of the sheriffs got up and said that he's with John Bel Edwards because he feels like supplemental pay will be protected for his deputies.
Oh, interesting.
So I asked Representative Edwards if he is committed to the association on supplemental pay to protect it, and he told me no, but that he would make the promise right then and there, and he did. He said that he will not, quote, I will not mess around with supplemental pay, end quote.
Okay, I've got a question for you. The Sheriff's Association, as you said, there's some Republicans in there who are going to support this Democrat. I mean, are they going to actively campaign for a Democrat, even though they're Republican?
I believe so. That there's already a meeting being put together in Acadiana between sheriffs, clerks, and assessors to figure out a way to get behind John Bel Edwards. But however, there are also Republican sheriffs supporting David Vitter, particularly in North Louisiana. I've spoken to a few that told me that, hey, look, there's no way I can go out in my parish and campaign for a Democrat.
On the other hand, Norman, remember, is a Republican, very anti-Vitter.
Right. And that they'll either be working for David Vitter on Election Day or staying home. And, you know, of course, Sheriff Neil Norman's finished with 88% in his home parish.
And David Vitter got 38% in that parish, I believe.
And while we're talking about Neil Norman, let's talk about this spy issue. They sort of following
One
up
more
on
quick
it.
thing about Obama. I think one thing to look at is Orleans Parish, for example, largely African American, a lot of Democratic votes really underperformed in terms of turnout. There was only about 32%. There's room for John Bel Edwards to grow on the Democratic side, so I think it's worth remembering that. Spygate, yes. Noel Normand and David Vitter. This goes back to Harry Lee and David Vitter. This goes back to the ethics and gambling wars of the 90s, really. So Newell Normand is having coffee at Royal Blend in Metairie, as he often does, with kind of this motley group of people, including a private investigator who, it turns out, has been hired to look into some of the prostitution stuff with Vitter. Won't say who hired him, but he says not John Cummings, who's also there, a Democratic lawyer who is a donor to John Bel Edwards. The Vitter campaign, once this guy was caught and they had to say something, said our target was not Newell Normand, our target was John Cummings. They won't say why.
A man with a white beard,
which
could have been Ernest Hemingway, Santa Claus.
Santa Claus, as John Cummings said, who also said David Vitter's been very naughty.
Yes.
So we don't know, and it's a mess. And John, I kind of wonder whether this private investigator from Texas didn't even know that was the sheriff he was taping. Thought he was taping these other guys, and Newell Normand sees that what he's doing, comes over, confronts him. The guy runs, he trespasses, gets arrested, and it's just a big embarrassment and an opportunity for Newell Normand to kind of come out and tell the world David Vitter would be the worst governor in the history of the state of Louisiana.
And so is this something that we're going to continue to hear about over these next 3 weeks?
Oh,
It's not going to go
so.
away.
I think it's going to continue to drip throughout these final weeks.
And it kind of, if there is this image of Vitter, and you kind of wonder why someone who survived this long is having trouble now. I wonder if there's this kind of general sense that it's a very cynical campaign, and maybe it's a little like Bobby Jindal that way. People see him that way, and spying on private citizens is part of that.
No, at some point he's going to have to do at least one debate, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
Well,
He said.
the WVLA in Baton Rouge has planned a debate, and the deadline was today for David Vitter to reply. John Bel Edwards has confirmed. LPB in Baton Rouge, Louisiana Public Broadcasting, has a debate that John Bel Edwards has confirmed for, but David Vitter has not yet. He hasn't said no either. So right now, I'm being told by the John Bel Edwards campaign that they're not going to confirm for any more debates until they figure out what David Vitter is going to do with these 2 other debates.
Well, I'm sure the voters of the state would really like to see the 2 of them debate.
I would love to see
certainly
the 2 of them.
At least once. Are there going to be endorsements from the 2 who didn't make it?
Hey, that's the big question, right? I mean, I think what we're seeing on Jay Darden's side is that some of his top staffers have officially endorsed John Bel Edwards. We've seen his communications director, Marcia, and one of his chief staffers, Cody Allen Wells, have endorsed him. And now today there's an email went out from Chris Kirkpatrick, an attorney who is involved with the Jaywalkers, which is kind of Jay Darden's boosters, saying that, hey, we all need to get involved. There's been some checks written, some money bundled for John Bel Edwards from Jay Darden's side. Scott Angel's side, meanwhile, is been kind of quiet. Okay.
Well, I guess we're going to be finding out. Gone to Lieutenant Governor now. Errol.
Yeah, well, one thing, a mild surprise in this, from all along it was known that Kip Holton would be in the primary. I think most people might have thought that John Young would beat out Billy Nongasser for the other spot in the race, even though it was close, and the possibility of either one happening. But what did happen is Nungasser pulled past John Young, and so it's going to be in the runoff. In all likelihood, Billy Nungasser is going to be the next lieutenant governor of Louisiana. Where did Nungasser's strength come from? Well, one from the publicity he got from BP, and so that made him well known. If you look at the vote between Nungasser and John Young, above Baton Rouge, well, Baton Rouge and above, they pretty much broke even. The difference was in the Cajun country, in Acadiana, that Nungasser opened up a margin there, and he now lives in Lafayette, so that helped. And another factor is that Nungasser's dad, for a long time, was an activist in the Republican Party. Back when there weren't that many Republicans, but I'm sure there's some old family loyalties. They kind of came into play here. And
close to Dave Trees.
Yeah. And so a vote here and a vote there could have made a difference to put it into the runoff. And so I think it comes down to that. What this race, going back to Darden in the governor's race, we've been saying lieutenant governor has never been a stepping stone for governor except for Kathleen Blanco, and I'm sure Nungasser is going to be the one to change this, but it's going to be an active campaign, but it looks very good for Billy Nungasser.
I think it does too. I don't think that there's a belief among Louisiana's political class that Kip Holton is going to be the one to break the Democratic curse this cycle. However, there's a lot of excitement among supporters of John Bel Edwards that Kip Holton's name on the ballot may drive turnout. But I wonder if Kip Holton doesn't benefit from having John Bel Edwards on the ballot,
because he really has not conducted much of a campaign
his fundraising and his campaigning, boots on the ground have been lackluster in the primary.
Is that going to pick up for the runoff, do you think?
If his performance in the primary is any indication of what kind of fundraising and campaign operation he's going to have in the runoff, I wouldn't expect anything spectacular.
Okay, I'm sure also Billy Nungasser's name recognition, because he had run for lieutenant governor before, helped him this go around.
I think Billy Nungasser was at practically every event that I went to statewide this cycle, and look, he managed to pick up 25% out of the River Parishes, Baton Rouge region off of Kip Holton. And like we've said before, that Acadiana would be the swing region, and he picked that up, and he certainly muscled his way into that runoff, and he's been here before.
Okay, close race between him and John Young, and he comes out on top. So he's up against Kip Holton now in the runoff. All right, Attorney General, a runoff there too. Stephanie.
Yes, the runoff candidates are the incumbent, Buddy Caldwell, Democrat turned Republican, and a Republican named Jeff Landry, former member of Congress, a real Tea Party guy, and someone who kind of swept in and picked up support from really the entire Republican establishment, even though the incumbents are Republican. People don't necessarily think he's a real Republican or too close to trial lawyers, things like that. It's very, in the runoff, in the primary, it was pretty close. Buddy Caldwell got about 35%, Jeff Landry 33%. But there's a big chunk of Democratic votes out there, 28% or so, and that really is probably likely to go to Caldwell, because Landry is really closely name recognition for one thing, and also Landry is pretty associated with the kind of far right of the Republican Party.
Tea
So
Party.
There's a rule when an incumbent gets less than 40%. That's
Yeah.
usually a sign of big trouble. It may not be the case in this election, but usually that is the case.
yeah, I mean, he's not a strong incumbent. I mean, there were Democrats who thought if a Democrat could win, this would be the race. And actually, Walt Leger looked into it, who was someone who's considered kind of an up-and-comer. He ended up not running, and these two Democratic candidates are not very well known. But if a strong Democrat had gotten in, I think that person might have had a shot.
Yeah, and look, even after Buddy Caldwell switched from Democrat to Republican, he continued to go to events like the Bayou Classic. He continued to go to Mary Landrieu's hospitality suite
Right.
at DC Mardi Gras. He continued to be a Democrat. And I think
People were filming him there. I
Republicans,
saw that.
I think Republicans were all sitting back wondering, what is he doing? Well, I
Yeah.
think we all know now, because if anyone's in a position to court these Democratic votes that are left on the table, it's Buddy Caldwell. It's not Jeff Landry, who ran to the right of the field.
Do you think the Louisiana voter at this point now is really that worried about the D or the R behind a name?
Certainly seems so. It seems like, the trends are showing us, and this speaks to the challenge for governor too, that look, if you vote Republican in the primary, you're more than likely going to vote for a Republican in the runoff. And we saw the polarizing effects of that in last year's U.S. Senate race. And really, even along racial lines. I mean, Mary Landrieu carried a very small percent of the black vote. Bill Cassidy carried a very small percent of the white vote. I got that backwards, didn't I? But
Yes. We know it, yeah.
and now I think we're starting to see this governor's race sadly develop along racial lines too. John Bell
Racial,
Edwards.
you mean partisan lines?
Racial lines.
Racial lines? Okay.
I think that there's been some accusations thrown at David Vitter for his latest ad,
Okay.
talking about John Bell Edwards' plan putting thugs on the street, and then also, I think John Bell Edwards didn't do a terrific job of turning out the vote in African American communities. And there's this kind of rural GOTV that's starting to develop very quietly. But I definitely feel that it's starting to develop that way, and I'm curious to see exactly where this is all going to go.
I think with the D and the R, it's the symbols they can attach to them, and that's why somebody like Vitter is going to be saying Obama,
Right.
Obama, Obama, because he wants people to see that D, and to think Obama, and when they think Obama, to think about big government, and so that's what they're trying to do.
I love the fact that there's so many people involved in this race that aren't on the ballot. John Bell Edwards is Jindal. David Vitter is Obama.
Right.
Now
Occasionally
we
Mitch
got
Landrieu shows up.
and then Mitch Landrieu, and then Sheriff Newell Norman.
The fact is, whoever's elected governor, neither Jindal or Obama are going to be around that much longer in terms of their terms ending. So,
Okay, let's move on now to some parish politics. Jefferson Parish and also St. Bernard Parish had votes on presidents.
okay, in Plaquemines Parish, I think y'all can tell me about this. I think we may have seen some political history here in that parish president's race. This was where we had the incumbent who was running Peralta, and as we know, we said and. Peralta, okay, I've heard of incumbents being defeated before. Okay, that's not unusual, but to be defeated with 3.3% of the vote, okay, that's
kind of wonder who those 3% were. Who's voting for
that's
still.
really unheard of, and so I think that career comes to a smashing end right now. And if running for re-election was his one bit of leverage in terms of his legal problems, he's lost that bit of leverage now. And I almost wonder how you finish out your term now, knowing you only got 3% of the vote. I mean, he will still be in office, I guess, a couple more months. And then, but as you say, we have a runoff in there. In Jefferson Parish, we had a parish president's election too. In this case, the parish president, the incumbent, was running for lieutenant governor, that being John Young. And the result here was no surprise. Mike Genney, the mayor of Kenner, won in the primary with 52% of the vote. So now somewhere in Kenner, the politics has started about who's going to be the next mayor of Kenner. There were several council elections in Jefferson Parish. There's the at-large race, and we saw Chris Roberts reelected. He barely won in the primary. He got 50.18% of the votes. But even if he had fallen a little bit short, that would have been a lead that would have been hard to overcome. And so I guess probably if whoever he got in the runoff with, the other person would have dropped out. And so he won substantially. And in that Metairie area council race, which was a close race, that we saw Jennifer Van Vranken winning with about 2/3 of the vote.
Right. Okay. Let's move on now
And again,
to
that would be a little victory for John Young, I guess.
well, that
'cause she
is,
was
yes.
in
That was
top
the labor
aid,
for you.
right,
His top
plus.
aide,
Yeah.
yeah, and she definitely had a pretty hearty victory there, that's
Yeah.
for sure, a very strong one. Okay, let's move over to legislature. You've been saying now for a while it's basically the same legislature that we saw before.
It is. By the end of election night, we saw 85% of the legislature was seated, just in time to watch David Vitter give his victory speech and say that there's a problem with those Baton Rouge politicians. You know, I asked a couple of those Baton Rouge politicians on election night what they thought about having to work with David Vitter in the spring next year when he's going after them during the campaign, and they just knowingly shook their head and said, "Yep, you know, we're the target of his campaign." And but then on the other hand, if John Bel Edwards is elected, this is a Democrat who's going to have to work with a Republican majority legislature, and so Republicans have so far lost one seat in the Senate. It's a seat out of Opelousas that Senator Albert Guillory holds right now. That has flipped to Democrat, and there are 2 pickups for Republicans in the House. It doesn't move the needle a whole lot. There could be maybe 1 or 2 more Republican pickups here in the runoff. We have 19 legislative seats still on the ballot. But at the end of the day, incumbents, I think, survived what could have been an anti-incumbent wave that could have swept through the state with these controversial tax votes that were taken during session. But only 3 incumbents lost their positions.
And it's interesting, the business community acted initially like they were really going to go after some of these legislators who voted for some of these tax increases, and then they really pulled back.
Yeah.
When you said about 70% of the legislature was returning, they didn't face any opposition or?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we saw a very large number who were returning with no opposition whatsoever. But after the races from Saturday night, we're looking at about 85% total overall of the legislature
are
returning.
going back, and they are going back to face some really tough fiscal issues.
They are. They wanted it and they got it. And it's
special
not going to be
sessions too,
pretty.
so their year could start really early.
It is, and it's going to start, you know, right after the runoff, we'll go into the transition period. There'll be a transition committee, and lawmakers will be very interested in that because they'll be jockeying for chairmanships during that same period that cabinet secretaries are trying to get a job. Then we'll go straight into the inauguration, straight into special sessions, straight into regular session, and the federal elections.
It's a very busy year ahead,
Yes.
that's for sure, and one with a lot of problems to confront. All right, we had also constitutional amendments on the ballot. So did the voters really understand these? What did they do?
I doubt it. These were really technical, and a lot of this was kind of inside baseball. There were 4 constitutional amendments, 2 won, 2 lost. Number 1 lost. That was basically to revamp the rainy day fund and make it partly for transportation. There were a number of issues tied up in it, and there was some opposition. That one went down. Number 2 was victorious. That was to basically allow the state treasurer to invest money in an infrastructure bank. That one, I think, was pretty popular. Everybody wants road work done, and it's kind of one more way
Would you
to pay
notice
for
something
it.
though? Look at the yes and no's on all
Yeah.
these elections. It's like
They're very close.
it's like low 50%
Yeah.
versus high 40%. Okay, and they're all so close that a few things that the votes are interchangeable
And
on
you
these.
really wonder, do people sit down and study them and figure out, or do they just kind of...
At that close, I mean, every
Yeah.
one of them is like that. It could almost just be accidentally
Yeah.
defeating it or approving them.
Yeah. Number 3, which actually went down by the largest margin, 54%. That's an interesting one. That one is real inside baseball. It was to change how the legislature divides up issues, what can be in what's known as a fiscal session versus a regular session, and it really doesn't affect much outside of how they do their business and how clear the rules are of what kind of vote can happen in which session. But it's interesting that it went down, and I was talking to the author of the bill, Julie Stokes, who's a representative from Jefferson Parish, actually at the Vitter event, and she said, you know, the fact that the word fiscal was in there, that's what she thought happened. There was no organized opposition to it, no interest groups came out against it. She thinks people saw that, and they're seeing tax increase, and they kind of instinctively voted no. And she kind of worries about how that bodes for as they're going forward, and there are going to be some very difficult fiscal issues.
And this was something
Find
that the
another word for
legislators...
fiscal.
Exactly, yes.
That's right. This is something that the legislators said really was needed, just to try to streamline their process.
Exactly. So again, did people understand that? If you're not sitting in Baton Rouge, it's very confusing.
Yeah.
Number 4 was this kind of crazy issue and it passed. So up in the northern part of the state, there's some public land owned by the city of Memphis, and there's a dispute over whether that can be taxed, whether the Louisiana prohibition on taxing publicly owned property applies to publicly owned property by someplace that's not in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. So there was a court decision, and this was seeking to clarify this. So there was actually very high turnout in that part of the state because there was a lot of money at stake.
So basically right now it comes down to we can tax the
Yes.
now the,
Yes.
the out-of-state or out-of-local
Exactly.
entity, we can begin charging them money.
Yes.
And we haven't been, or had we been before?
We had been
and it went
attempting to, and they sued.
and
So
it went to court, and
yes.
we lost, they won, but
Yes.
now we're going to be able to tax them because the voters said go ahead and do it.
Well, I maintain my stand. I think we should amend this so we can tax Houston and Dallas
There
too.
you go.
So
Well, just because.
just because.
Yes.
Just because, okay. Well, there were obviously winners, losers in the primary, surprising us sometimes, maybe not. Among those who found themselves not moving on to the
Lost.
runoff. Who do you think is going to be rising again in politics?
Well, there's several, but one that comes to mind in New Orleans is Roy Glapion, who ran for the state senate, was defeated. But he comes from his dad was a former councilman. He comes from a beloved family in New Orleans' Creole community, very active in the Zulu organization.
And in the bold political organization.
Roy Glapion himself was named UNO's Alumnus of the Year this year. And so the family is well known. And I think there's a lot of potential in New Orleans politics for him.
Okay, Jeremy?
I didn't know we were doing predictions tonight, but since we did, I do have my crystal ball paper here, and I think that the person's name written on this piece of paper will be on a ballot within 12 to 24 months. Stephanie Grace.
Oh my goodness.
Put
Never.
put the boudin on the grill. I think Scott Angel is going to be making a comeback, maybe in the 3rd district, maybe in the U.S. Senate race. But either way, we haven't heard the last of Scott Angel.
Stephanie.
I'm going to say we've talked about him some tonight. John Young. I don't know what he'll run for or if he will, but I think he was expecting to be lieutenant governor, possibly,
Yes,
so
yeah.
maybe he hasn't thought about it that much, but I have real trouble believing he's done.
Well, he's a lawyer. When you're a lawyer, you could always run for a judgeship at some
Exactly.
point.
Yeah.
So
He came out
And
of
he's
that's
been a
an
very
advantage,
effective,
yes.
he's been a very effective Jefferson Parish
was a
president.
and
He's
was a
done well.
popular one.
Yeah, very popular
Yes.
one there. So let me ask you this. They're already lining up to fill David Vitter's
Yes.
seat in the Senate. What if David Vitter is still sitting in that seat? Will they go after him?
I think if he loses, it'll be because Louisiana soured on his political
Yeah.
brand, and Republicans will smell blood in the water. And all, if not maybe just a few, will definitely be on that ballot.
It's interesting. They were all, I think most of the potential senators were at his victory party cheering him on Saturday
Yeah.
night.
More-
John Kennedy, Charles Bastani, John Fleming.
Will he run, though?
seat.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's the question. So the thing to remember is his seat is up in 2016 anyway, so
Right.
there will be an election, no
All
matter
righty.
what.
Never dull in Louisiana
Yes.
politics, never dull in the conversation here. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Be safe trick-or-treating, be it tonight or tomorrow night. Have a good evening.